I've always wondered how fundamentalist Christians can explain the use of the word apostasy in the Scripture. My understanding of apostasy is to have once had the faith, but to have turned totally away and rejected it. How can you justify once saved, always saved for those who the Scriptures say did apostasize?
Well, great question, and I think she nails it there. It's because some fundamentalists, not all, but some fundamentalists use that term very loosely and incorrectly, and her description of the term is correct. Apostasy refers to the act of having been in the true faith and then leaving it. That is the biblical, historical meaning of the word. So technically, from a fundamentalist perspective, if they believe once saved, always saved, apostasy really isn't possible. But what a fundamentalist would probably say, at least some, would say, well, that refers to those Christians who have been exposed to it, who maybe even kind of flirted with it, but then rejected it without ever becoming truly saved. The problem, of course, is, well, I've known, for instance, I knew a fundamentalist pastor who was saved for 20 years, had this great ministry, and then he committed adultery and walked away from the church. Well, was he ever saved? I was told by some people, no, he was never saved. Well, then how do you ever know that you really are saved?
How could that be a sign of assurance?
Right, there is no assurance if that...
You can only, in that sense, you can only know assurance with hindsight.
Right. So it creates a vicious, illogical circle that just cannot be reconciled.
And even, as you said, from your childhood, the division of your little church, that even fundamentalists can't agree on it.
Right, because there is no final arbiter of truth. There is no final authority on those issues.
Very good. Let's take our next caller. It's Margaret from Montana. Hello, Margaret. What's your question for us?
Hi, and I want to thank you for your program. It's so informative and educational.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret.
And a comment that I've heard many times before is that in some fundamentalist beliefs, Catholics are considered anti-Christian. And I can't understand that, and it's never been explained to me. And if you could, please explain it. And thank you.
All right, Margaret.
From my home state, Montana.
Yep.
Right. Well, fundamentalists who say that Catholics are anti-Christian, or, for instance, Tim LaHaye, who's a fundamentalist author, the co-creator and author of the Left Behind books, fundamentalist books, he describes Catholicism as Babylonian pagan mysticism. He calls it a pagan religion. Well, why is that? Because he believes that, for instance, Catholics worship Mary. So that and he, of course, uses false reasoning for that and doesn't understand the Catholic, the honor that we pay to Mary. So once he says that we worship Mary, then automatically we're not Christian. We're opposed to true Christianity because true Christians only worship God. Well, of course, anybody who's familiar with church teaching and documents knows that Catholics only worship God, that to do otherwise is a grave sin. But what happens is that fundamentalists will look at certain acts of Catholics and either misunderstand them or misinterpret them and then say, see, this is an anti-Christian action. You worship statues, you worship icons. Well, we don't. But since they think that we do, then they're able to say, well, that's an anti-Christian action. So,
do most fundamentalists hold to the view that very early on the church got off base?
Yeah, in fact, I've heard, I'm not kidding, I've heard fundamentalists say with all seriousness that within a year after the Ascension, everything had gone south. And so usually, though, there's a couple of variations. One is that by the end of the first century, another one that's very common is that with Constantine in the 300s, that's where the big break came and things finally went south, and Constantine paganized the church and turned it into the Roman Catholic Church. Again, those views don't hold up to an accurate understanding of history.
Yeah. So basically, that's starting with a presupposition that the Catholic Church is wrong, and then reading it into history.
Right.
And anything you find in history where you find Catholicism, obviously that's a proof that it went off base.
And many conservative Baptists, have this theory called the trail of blood, and they'll say that they are the true Christians, and they will trace this trail of blood, which is essentially underground Christians who existed through 2,000 years of Catholic persecution, and they are the ones who've kept the true faith alive. Actually, it was, I think, John Smith founded the Baptist denomination in the 1600s or early 1700s. So, again,
I actually have a series of notes from a 13-week course I taught when I was ordained Congregationalist back in 1983. I taught the local church 13 weeks on church history. And I look back in those notes, and that's what I did, is that really all the people that were the Congregationalists holding on to the true church were all the heretics. Every group, the Waldensians, all the different groups that were considered these heresies, holding things that were contrary to Scripture, really the early sola scriptura folk. And that's what earliest heresies of the church were all basically sola scriptura problems. Let's go with this next email. Mark Davenport from Alexandria, Virginia. Mark, thank you for your email. I've been listening to Journey Home semi-regularly the past 4 or 5 months. I attend a Pentecostal church. I've attended other churches as well and never heard vicious anti-Catholic sentiments. Occasionally comment about the Pope worshiping saints, etc. The few Catholic services I've attended have had a short homily, I believe it's called, but I enjoy a good sermon. I enjoy a good Bible-based message that may go 30 minutes or so, and I miss that at a Catholic Mass. Lots of things in there.
Yeah, there are a lot of things in there. First of all, because there are like 26 or 28,000 different Protestant denominations, it's difficult to get to all of them. And I'm sure, you know, I've been to many evangelical churches where there was never any mention of the Catholic Church. It just did not exist, essentially. I attended many fundamentalist churches and even some evangelical churches where there were comments made either from the pulpit or in discussion, you know, outside of the pulpit. So as far as homilies, well, of course, we as Catholics don't look at the Mass or the Divine Liturgy as being centered around necessarily the homily, although it is an important part of the Mass. Of course, the heart of the Mass is the Eucharist. And so once a person understands and appreciates the reality of the Eucharist, Jesus Christ, actual body, soul, blood, and divinity, then that puts everything in perspective and we begin to see the priority. And so, of course, the liturgy of the Word is very important. Christ comes to us in the Word. The homily should expound that. It should be an important part of it. And sometimes homilies aren't as good as maybe they could be. And sometimes they aren't very long. But the length is not so much the issue as whether or not the gospel is proclaimed and expounded. And, of course, that we have a valid Eucharist.
And I'll admit, I mean, when you go to any Protestant church that has the Lord's Supper from time to time, I remember when I used to preach in the Church of Scotland, and they had the Lord's Supper only once a year in that particular group. Presbyterians, Lutherans had it once a month. Well, on that Sunday, when we had the Lord's Supper, the homily was shorter.
Right.
I mean, it has to be, because now you've got sacrament and the Word, and so you're trying to make a balance on that.
This is very odd, very quickly. Growing up in the fundamentalist group I grew up in, we celebrated the Lord's Supper every week. But it was a very tacked-on variety. At the end, 10 minutes, grape juice, bread, very quick usually. The thing is, if you're used to a 45-minute sermon or a 30-minute sermon, and that becomes the heart of your worship, then if you go to a Catholic Mass, that certainly is going to seem odd to you.
Yeah. That's right. Let's take our next